Well, I appreciate the opportunity to get to speak to you again this morning. As you may have seen from the bulletin, the title of my lesson is Why is Mankind So Discontent? I thank Dan for preaching half my lesson for me this morning during Bible study. But that's okay. It was a good introduction. There's a few of the verses that he talked about this morning that we're going to go back and look at again, and that's okay. If you were here Wednesday night, some of the things that we studied in our Wednesday night lesson go hand in hand with what we're going to talk about this morning as well. When we think about the concept of man being so discontent, you have to talk about materialism, and that's going to be an aspect of the sermon, but that's not all of it this morning. When we think about materialism, we are kind of at the height of the year for the evidence of materialism. When we think about, the people that are going out and buying gifts and things for Christmas, and their whole mindset is wrapped up around buying things and having things. And while there can be some good things done during this time of year, trying to help others and benefit others and giving gifts out of love, I don't want to take away from that, because there can be some good that comes from that. But the reality is, especially in our country, there's a great mindset that just is wrapped up in materialism and the desire for more things. Man is always striving for something more, something bigger, something faster, something newer. We always want more. And with all of this striving or even achieving for more, when we get it, we want more beyond that. And that seems to be the nature of man many times. We as Christians are not immune to this. And we can fall into the same traps that the world has. Many of us as Christians want something, whether it's a newer car, something faster. I'm sure Dan would like to have a faster car than the one he has. But we find ourselves sometimes wanting more also, even as Christians, and not being content with the things that we have. And the reality is that even as man gets more, when you look at the man that got more, what's he want now? He wants something else beyond that. Even when they get what they thought they really wanted. If I could just have that item, then I'd be content. And as soon as they get it, they think of something else they would like to have as well. Picture the person that has what you really want. What do they want? When you look at that person and you think, well, if I just had what they had, I'd be content. Well, they want something else too. And we could find ourselves in that same position. In this way, we fail to be content with the things that we have. And I know our minds are going towards material things, but we're going to get into some examples in the Bible, Paul in particular, and about being content. And it wasn't always just about things, sometimes the situations. I'm not saying that these things that we may want are necessarily wrong in and of themselves. It may be the things that we want are good health. Maybe the things that we want are physical needs, not just desires, not just extras. Maybe the things that we want are good in and of themselves. Many of the things that we may want come from hard work. Maybe we've earned them. We don't want just a free handout. We want something better for ourselves, and we're willing to work for it. So many times the things that we want, do come from hard work. It may be that we're just striving to be better at what we do. Maybe that's the more that we want, striving to be better at the things we do at our job. If you would be turning with me over to Colossians chapter 3. Maybe sometimes we want something more so that we can share it with someone else. So there can be some good things that come from a desire to have more than what we have now. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 23, Paul says here to the church in Colossae, "And whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not to men." When we think about the concept of working for our living, working for the things that we have, We have encouragement here by Paul to strive heartily. Work hard for the things that you have. So I want to start out the lesson by saying that just by wanting to do more, have more, to do better is not always necessarily a bad thing. It's not sinful in and of itself. Working hard and striving for the things that we have, striving for excellence, is a principle that we find in the New Testament. Doing things as if we are serving the Lord. So those things that we want maybe aren't sinful in and of themselves, is the point I'm trying to make. But if that consumes our thinking, if that consumes our mindset day to day of having more, having extra, having better, if that's what consumes our mind is the physical things of this earth, then maybe we have a problem and we fail to see where true contentment comes from, where that true contentment lies. When we start to think of these things, of these rewards that we have and that we may have worked for, we do gain some happiness and contentment in the moment when we are awarded or rewarded for hard work, like we see there in Colossians 3. But to kind of start off the main point of the lesson this morning, if you would turn to Philippians chapter 4. And if you've got a ribbon and want to put it in Philippians, we're going to be in Philippians a lot today. Philippians chapter 4, Paul talking to the church at Philippi here. Let's just read verse 11 and 12. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And we're going to look at some examples of Paul's situations where he did abound, times when he was in need. He knew how to be hungry. He knew how to be full. But he says, I have learned to be content. And I've underlined in my notes here, I have learned. What does that tell me? It's not a natural instinct. It wasn't a natural instinct for Paul to just, well, whatever happens, happens. I'm fine with whatever. No, that was an aspect of his life. He had to learn how to be content in these things. So that should be an encouragement for each of us. We can learn, like Paul learned, to be content with the things that we have. So how was it that Paul was content in all these different conditions? Well, for starters, Paul's focus, once he found that contentment, his focus wasn't on things, it wasn't on self, and it wasn't on situation. And we're going to break those down a little bit and look at some of Paul's things, his self and his situation, and find out how he was able to be content regardless of what those were. When we think about Paul not being focused on things of this life, turn back maybe just a page, Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. Let's look at what Paul's situation or what his life could have been like. It says, for we are the circumcision who worship God. Verse 4. Though I also might have confidence in the flesh, if anyone else think he may have confidence in the flesh, I more so. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, concerning the law a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. As far as Jews were concerned, Paul had a pretty substantial stature among other Jews. He could have been extremely wealthy in the situation that he grew up in and the way he found himself, the crowd that he could have run with. Let's also go back to Acts chapter 22. Paul was very well connected in the Jewish realm. Acts 22, let's read verses 3 and verse 5. Acts 22 and 3 says, I am indeed a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our fathers' law, and was zealous toward God as you are today. Verse 5, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there in Jerusalem to be punished. Now we see this in Paul's early life. Before he became a Christian, his intent was to go and capture Christians, put them in prison, punish them in whatever way he found necessary. But the key point here is he was very well connected with the council, the elite of that day. Paul could have been an extremely wealthy man because of who he was connected to. He could have had a position of prominence, but that was not his concern once he recognized what was important. Once he became a Christian, those things were behind him. We know that many times Paul lived a very lowly life. He said there were times he was hungry. He went without food. He definitely went without things as he traveled around and really didn't have much of a home as he traveled and completed his journeys. The other thing we see is Paul was not concerned with self. And that's evident. We could spend the rest of the time talking about the circumstances Paul found himself in where he was not concerned with self. But while we're here, let's go over to Acts chapter 14. We're going to look at a couple things that happened to Paul. Acts 14, let's start in verse 19. Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul, dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Sounds pretty substantial. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So Paul was nearly put to death by stoning. He rises up, goes on to another city, and what does he do then? And when they had preached the gospel to the city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Does that sound like someone who's concerned with self? He just got stoned and left for dead. They assumed he was dead. He gets up and continues preaching, which is what they stoned him for in the first place, and even comes back to the same city. Turn the page to Acts 16. We'll begin in verse 22. Once again, then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrate tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them in the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. If we would continue reading on, we see that Paul and Silas go on singing and praying and ultimately end up baptizing the Philippian jailer and his family because of their willingness to put themselves at risk. Paul was just put in prison and beaten because he was preaching, and while in prison he continues teaching, standing up for the faith, standing up for what he believes in. Doesn't sound to me like Paul is concerned with self. I think for most of us, if we found ourselves in prison, our concern wouldn't be, can I teach someone, one of my cellmates, or even the guard about Christ? We'd be thinking, how can I get out of here? How can I not get beaten again? Acts 21. Acts 21 will begin in verse 10. And as we stayed many days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. And when he had come to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own hands and feet and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." Now when we heard these things, both we and those from the place pleaded with him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." So when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, "The will of the Lord be done." So here, those that surrounded Paul, those that loved him, the other disciples that were there with him, when they find out that the prophet comes and Agabus comes and says, "If you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound. You're going to be put in prison." As if we would continue reading in Acts, we would see that's exactly what happened. The Jews put together a plot and they bind Paul. Ultimately, he goes on to Rome as a prisoner. But as we can see here, once again, Paul's concern was not with himself. As he said, "I'm ready to die for Christ if that's what it takes." And going to prison, that's not something new for Paul. But his concern was not with self. Thirdly, Paul's ability to be content was he was not concerned with the situation. And we kind of touched on that a little bit, but we'll look at a little bit another instance. Paul wasn't focused on his situation. If we turn to Acts 24, this is a follow-up to what we've just read. Paul has been in prison, put in prison, and taken on to Rome because he appealed to Caesar. In Acts 24, let's begin in verse 25. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. In other words, he wanted Paul to pay him for his release. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So at this point, he's been in there for at least 2 years. He's been imprisoned because he stood up for Christ, stood for what he believed in. Paul was not concerned with his situation. He wasn't content because of the situation he found himself in, because it wasn't a pleasant one. It's thought that Paul spent about 5 years of his ministry in prison, actively in prison. It's also thought that he was in prison while writing some of his letters, letter to the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and also to Philemon. But when we read through those letters, the focus isn't about his situation. The focus is about who he was writing to and maybe correction they needed to make in their congregation, or praise for the things that they were doing. The ways they needed to live their life as Christians was the focus of his letter, not the situation that he found himself in. Put yourself in Paul's shoes. You've been in prison for several years, and you're writing a letter to someone. What would the letter be about? Can you help me find a way to get out of here? Not Paul. His focus wasn't on his situation, but rather on the souls of those that he was speaking to. Go ahead and turn back to Philippians chapter 4. One of the letters that is thought to have been written while Paul was in prison. Philippians 4, verse 22. At the end, as he's closing this letter to the church at Philippi, verse 22 says, "All the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household." Imagine that. The leader of the free world, as they knew it at that time, Caesar's household, some of his household, Paul had been able to convert while he was in prison. He saw the value of the situation he was in rather than how terrible it was. He made use of that situation. How could Paul give up on the prominence that he had? The family he was born into, the ability, the connections that he had. How could he give up on that prominence with being well respected by the Jews? Being able to be very wealthy if he wanted to be. He went from that to suffering, to beating, to imprisonment. He suffered shipwreck, threat of death several times, nearly death. He was wrongfully accused by the Jews, put in prison, shipped off to Rome because he appealed to Caesar, and held in prison for an extended period of time while being innocent. He found himself in some pretty bad situations and doing without many times. Yet still, while he wrote this letter, he said, I have learned to be content. We're often discontent because our plans didn't go like we wanted them to. Paul's entire life, from the time he became a Christian and on, didn't go the way he had planned it to. So what's the takeaway for us today as we wrap up the lesson? How can we learn to be content like Paul did? If we think about the three main reasons that Paul was able to be content, he wasn't focused on things, he wasn't focused on self, and he wasn't focused on the situation. How can we apply that to our lives today? So let's look at a few verses before we close. We're obviously not going to stop having needs. We all have, the need for clothing, shelter, food, things of that nature. But it's interesting that Paul said he was content even when he was hungry. Abby and I we've done some fasting for health reasons. There's some benefits to doing some fasting. And I can tell you after the first 12 hours, I wasn't very content because I'm used to eating pretty regular. And learning how to be content when you're hungry, that would be a challenge, I can tell you for sure. We won't stop having needs. If you would, turn with me back to 1 Timothy chapter 6. What we need to do is stop looking for things to bring us contentment. First Timothy chapter 6, let's begin in verse 6. Now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. As we think about the materialism that's in our land today, and that we can fall victim to, even as Christians, I'm sure all of us can look around and see those whose life have become a wreck because of their striving for things or trying to hold on to things. We see here in Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. In Matthew chapter 6, we won't go there to read it. Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 31, he talks about being content with just the needs of this life. Food, shelter, clothing. God knows we need those things, and He'll make sure we have the things that we need. And learning how to be content with the things that we need and not all the things that we want. I did a lesson, maybe it's been months ago, but where we talked about understanding the difference between needs and wants. And in this country, we have a real struggle with understanding the difference between the things that we need and what we just want. The second way that we can find the contentment that Paul did is stop worrying about self. If our focus is more about the welfare of others than the desire of ourself, we might be surprised how much more content our life could be. Let's go to Romans chapter 12 for a minute. I may have told you in the past, Romans 12 is probably one of my favorite chapters. There's a lot there for us. In Romans chapter 12, let's read verse 3. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. The key point I want to take out of that verse is don't think too much of ourselves. And sometimes when we're caught up with our discontentment because of what's happening to me, because of self, that's the problem. We think too much of ourselves. If we drop on down to verse 9, and we think about focusing on others, we'll read through this, and there's a few extra verses in here that don't apply directly, but you'll get the point. Let's read verse 9 through the end of the chapter. It says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. That can be tough. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to the wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The takeaway I'd like you to get from those verses is if we're focused on the well-being of others rather than the well-being of self, we're going to be more content. I can promise you that. Go ahead and turn back to Philippians again. This time Philippians chapter 1. Philippians 1, let's read 21 through 24. This is Paul speaking here again. He says, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I choose I cannot say. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. When you think about all the difficulties and struggles Paul had gone through, he had come to the terms with the fact that I'd be better off if I died and went to be with the Lord. That would be much better for me in the situation that he found himself in prison at this time. But Paul recognized it's better for you if I stay. So I don't want what's best for me, I want what's best for you. Paul gave of himself in many different ways. But I think that was linked to Paul's contentment. I'm here to serve you, you brethren, not myself. And then thirdly, stop being anxious about our situation. And that is very tough to do. Philippians chapter 4, a verse we should all be familiar with, but let's read it anyway. Philippians 4 and verse 6 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. When we find ourselves in a very difficult uncomfortable, unpleasant situation. That's the first verse we should read. But it can be very difficult to not be focused on our situation. And maybe that's what brings us the discontentment. We want out of that situation. One of the other verses we read there in Acts or in Romans 12 talked about being patient. One of the things I think about, if I find myself in a situation that I'm very uncomfortable with and I would like to get out, I need to think back, did I pray for patience? Because maybe this is God teaching me patience. One of the things when we find ourselves in a bad situation and it's bothering us, we want out of it, first thing we need to ask ourselves is, can I change it? Maybe I'm the one that got me into this situation in the first place. Is there something I can do to change it? Maybe it requires some growth or change on my part. And maybe I can't change it. Maybe it's just the situation I find myself in, like Paul when he was in prison. He couldn't change that. That's where he was. So rather than being focused on that situation and worrying about something that he couldn't do anything about, he found a way to make use of it and actually found an opportunity to teach the household of Caesar about Christ. So if I can't change it, how can I make use of this situation to serve the Lord? Maybe it's just through my patience and my example to others that, I'm in a bad situation and I can be content. Does that not glorify God? So what can I do to glorify God in the situation that I find myself in? Note that being content doesn't mean that we wouldn't change the situation if we could. It doesn't mean just, whatever happens, happens. I'll just have to be okay with it. If we can change it, we'll do something about it. But we might find opportunities to improve what we have, maybe something about ourselves because of the situation that we're in. We should use the opportunities, like I said, to the best of our ability, like Paul did, to bring glory to God. But we must realize, like Paul did, that our contentment doesn't come from our situation. There's a reason man struggles so much with finding contentment. And it's because we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking for it to come through things of this life. It's not here. Our contentment will never be here if we're truly serving Him. True contentment comes from the spiritual. It's never going to come from the earthly. Paul had a really good grasp on this. And that's why he was ready to leave this life and go on to the next one, because he realized that's a better place. That's better for me. He recognized also that, this is where I need to be right now, and that's okay, but this is temporary. I'll move on when the time's right. But his true contentment was not from this life or this earth or the things in it. It came from the spiritual. And those are the things that are important. If we make those things important to us, we'll find the contentment. But it'll take time. That's not something that you're going to walk out of here today perfectly content with everything that's going on in your life and all the things that you have. As Paul said, I have learned to be content. So that's something that we have to learn. But we have to want to learn those things. It has to be our desire. Go with me to Philippians 4, and the lesson will be yours. Philippians 4, let's read verses 8 and 9. Paul says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are good of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. If we take the example that we've looked at with Paul today and where he found his contentment, and we think about where he didn't find his contentment in this life, then the God of peace will be with you. You will find that contentment that you're looking for. So my question for you today is, where will you find your contentment? Is it the things of this life, and those are so easily distracting to us? Or will they come from the spiritual things that God has given us and promised to be with us if those are the things that we hold dear to us? So this morning, as we bring our lesson to a close, if you would have any needs of the congregation, if you need to be baptized and become a Christian, you have that opportunity today. If you just need the prayers of the brethren to get through some difficult times or situations or the things that are making you discontent, then please come forward as we stand and sing.